Hello and good morning, everybody. It's Colin Cassin speaking with you this morning. We're just going to give everybody another minute or so to trickle in, and we'll begin the webinar shortly. So hang tight, and I'll be back online in about a minute to kick us off. So good morning, everybody. I'd like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from Peterborough, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, which is made up of Curve Lake First Nation, Alderville First Nation, and Hiawatha First Nation. I'd like to offer my gratitude to the First Nations for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. And may we honor those teachings with today's webinar. Good morning and hello, my name is Colin Cassin. I'm the Policy Manager with the Invasive Species Centre. And welcome to our August webinar on our ongoing monthly series. So I hope you've tuned into the last few. We've had a few in the hopper over the summer and appreciate everyone tuning in and making the most of this series. We've got a few great webinars upcoming later into the month of September and October. That I'll do a quick plug for at the end of today's session, but wanted to start off by welcoming everybody and thanking you again for attending today's webinar. A few quick housekeeping notes before we jump into the fun stuff. Today's session is going to be recorded and we'll be distributing the link via email to everyone who's registered for the event. So if you know anybody who wasn't able to attend in person, but they have registered, not to worry, they'll be seeing the webinar recording come through shortly. And if you'd like to check out some past webinars, we put them up on the Invasive Species Centre's YouTube page, so you can check out all past webinars there as well. We'd encourage you to do so. Some great technical webinars, some excellent outreach content, some nice policy information as well, and a little bit of everything in between. So encourage you to make use of that great resource, especially for welcoming maybe new people into the fold of what we're doing on invasive species in Ontario, across Canada and beyond. So as I mentioned, today's session is going to be recorded, and just the other quick housekeeping note to pass on, in GoToWebinar, you should have a control panel on the side of your screen. Some people using the desktop version versus the web version might see it a little bit differently, but in there you'll find a questions bar with a little play triangle beside it. If you can click that down and make use of that function throughout the webinar, is a great way to interact with our speakers today. We'd appreciate it. Feel free to note any questions ongoing throughout the presentation, and we will pause at the end to address as many of those as we can. So encourage you to make use of that great function and connect in with myself and our other two guest speakers, which I'll be introducing shortly. So on with the show and the main reason why we're coming together today. And really that is what's happening at the intersection between invasive species and their intersection with horticulture and gardening in Ontario. There's a number of players and a number of excellent programs and resources that have been developed. And I think the kind of reason for being for today's webinar is try and use that as an opportunity to connect two of those ideas together, especially for as wide and diverse an audience as we have today. So scanning quickly through our registrants before, you know, some of the names are familiar faces and people who are working in horticulture and invasive species. And I see a pretty wide range. So we see lots of gardeners, horticulturalists, master gardeners in there, some folks from municipalities and other landscape design interests, some people working within government at all three levels, on the planning, on the policy side, on the implementation. So a really nice diverse group of folks and interests here today. And I think that's exactly who we're trying to target is as many of you folks as possible, just trying to give a little bit of a guide, I suppose, more than anything, about what exists and what the framework is, and try and address that thorny question in our side, which is, wait, we're able to use invasive species in the garden? What's up with that? And so without any further ado, let's jump into the content and presentation today. So we've got 3 speakers today. Really excited that they were able to share their time here today. As I said before, my name's Colin Cassin, and I'll say hello quickly. We're battling for internet today, so I just wanted to say hello. So there's a face to the name. And I'm the manager of invasive species policy at the Invasive Species Centre, and I'm happy to be an active member in the Horticulture Outreach Collaborative, which is a working group of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. We have the co-chair, the founding co-chair of that group, the HOC today, Colleen Cirillo. Colleen's going to jump in after a few slides of mine, and really excited to have her and her breadth of knowledge, extensive knowledge on the Grow Me Instead Guide, a really popular program that the Plant Council runs and resource they distribute, and really glad that she's able to join us from her home in Toronto today. And David Dutkiewicz is the entomology technician at the Invasive Species Centre. David's an avid gardener and has been working to utilize one of the tools that Colleen's going to be promoting, the Grow Me Instead Guide, at a great community garden that he's going to daylight for us today up in Sault Ste. Marie. So really pleased that everyone's able to join us here today, and hopefully this resource, this webinar can act as a bit of a resource and information guide to connect horticulture and invasive species for you today. And if there was one question or kind of motivator for what are we doing here today, it's a question I think I assume many of us kind of come into often, and it's the realization point for some people that, wait, we can buy invasive species in our garden centers, and we're putting a lot of effort and resources towards controlling them in our natural environments. And why is this so? And that's a really complicated question, and I don't think we can fully answer it today, but we're going to make our best attempt at just kind of laying the groundwork and giving a bit of context to the motivations behind that question. And so I'm sure you see and hear that, you know, back in the days of trade shows, and hopefully those are here to come very shortly. That's a really common question that we get at kind of those community outreach opportunities. And we certainly see these conversations online, and you know, there's no shortage of examples of it, but this is a great example I came across not too long ago, a couple months back, and it just highlighted the issue so well. Somebody posting to a great group, for a quick plug on this Facebook group, the Ontario Native Plant Gardening Group, and a really nice forum for 19,000 people to exchange some ideas. So quick plug for that if you're interested. But it's a question that often comes up in that group and many, many others, is this idea of shock that I can't believe we're still able to buy and sell these things. And this realization point that I think many of us are aware of, and they're really common ideas and threads. And so that's what we wanted to do, is just build a bit of an introduction webinar around this idea and set the course, I guess, to indicate to people what resources are available and maybe what the conditions from a regulatory perspective are that give us some opportunities maybe looking forward. So, you know, my goal for the next few slides is to present the issue, and I think many of you understand the case for why invasive species and horticulturally leaning invasive species or utilized species or legacy species from horticulture are a problem. And I hope I'm going to speak to your favorite example today. There's too many to mention, of course, but why not highlight a few of the worst actors? And so calorie pair and Bradford pair, I think, you know, this webinar is being presented in an Ontario context, and this is a great example of a species that we're kind of on the front line of in many respects. We've seen it from our neighbors to the south being very well aware of this. Many of their extension offices are very much concerned about this, and you know, having to deal with this at the community level. And I would say it's something that we're starting to see more of in Ontario. To try and give you a snapshot of where it's at, I don't think it's as well established as maybe some of those great legacy species that we're more familiar with, but I wanted to note it's a good example. And of course, it looks beautiful, and it has you know, a wonderful place to be used if you're thinking of it from the image on the left. But many of us on the line, and myself included, see it through a different lens when we think of what is calorie pair or Bradford pair, and we think about it with the species on the right in mind. And so, you know, looking at it in kind of a similar state, this is the kind of condition that we'll see this species. So a great example of one that, of course, if it would stay where it was planted, would be lovely and have great utilization on our landscape. But the realization that we come to is that it tends to escape into natural environments, such as the image on the right. Unfortunately, there's a few examples of it's happening. Winged Unimas, something I'm looking out my window, seeing mine in the backyard, which I assure you will have to go soon. But this is a very common, if we're looking in subdivisions and kind of more built-up landscapes, a very common plant with a bit of a legacy to it as well. So great picture of it in all its glory on the left, and then burning bush from an invasive species perspective on the right. For thinking about the same kind of environment of I'm not sure, maybe common buckthorn, honeysuckles, those kind of understory shrubs that are well-known invasives. Very similar kind of ecological niche to be found there, especially in Ontario. So one that has been fairly widely utilized and planted across the province, and one that we're seeing more and more bleed out into our natural environments. English ivy, again, one I'm sure we're very much familiar with. If it would stay in the pot, it would be a lovely plant. But where we do tend to see it in a natural environment would be perhaps on those slopes that kind of run adjacent from someone's garden into maybe a conservation area or a more natural space. In this image here, you're seeing it climb up some of these trees on the right. And where we would see it, we'd certainly see it something like that. In Ontario, we'd very much see it as an invasive ground cover occupying space that would otherwise be utilized by native wildflowers, things like trillium, spring ephemerals. A great example of a species that would kind of occupy that same niche. So unfortunately, there's lots of great pictures available. I hope maybe you have a spot in mind of where you can see this on your landscape. Something to watch out for, and I think another good example if we're looking for those species to point to with those legacy impacts. And of course, a really tough species to remove. All of those ground cover invasives, having those similar traits of being very difficult to manage. So a good case study for what does this look like? Why is this a problem? Very similar species here with vinca, a couple species widely used in Ontario, major and minor, or periwinkle to most. Again, if it would stay contained within a rock garden or within a planter, generally no concerns. It's a wonderful addition, but the problem is that many of these species don't stay where they're intended to go, or through less than desirable activities in terms of disposal of invasive plant material. The community dump sites in quotes behind a subdivision perhaps, or at a trailhead. A really common issue I think many of us come across is really that's when these things become established and take a stronghold in the understories of our native communities. So that's what it looks like. And I wanted to give a little bit of a quick policy primer to everyone here in terms of, I think, one big opportunity that we have and one piece of legislation and associated regulations in an Ontario context that has been used and certainly shows promise to be used to at least start to address horticulture as a pathway. And that is the Invasive Species Act of Ontario. It came out in 2015, and it was a really exciting benchmark. And the act was preceded by the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan, which was about 2012 release. And that really kind of created the framework here and created the path forward on, not just specific, of course, to invasive species and horticulture, that, that's an issue contained within, but invasive species more broadly, and species being a very general, broad definition that applies to multiple taxa. And so, the regulations that are associated with this came into force back in late 2016. And so, this table on the right here, what you're seeing here are kind of the first wave of species that were included as regulated under that. And again, it's not a specific piece of regulation or legislation that's addressing horticulture and invasive species, but they are a component of that issue more broadly. And so really this act and regulations came into force with the utilization purpose here of stopping and preventing the introduction and spread of species. And it's not to say that all invasive species were included on day one. This is about adding different species to different classes or groupings of regulation. And so you're seeing here kind of a suite of fish, aquatic invertebrates, plants, and restricted plants as well. So a little bit different actions associated with those. And this gives us an opportunity for the first time in an Ontario context to, at least from an invasive species perspective, to be regulating or prohibiting the sale, the buying and trade of organisms, some organisms in trade, such as those listed here. And horticulture is an example of a pathway within organisms and trade to kind of broaden out that structure a little bit more. And what I want to do with the next couple slides is paint a little bit of a picture of specifically, in a case study perspective, what can this do? This regulation and regulating a species as either prohibited or restricted, what can that do for us, and how can that be an effective tool of preventing or mitigating the impacts of invasive species on horticulture? And a species we like to talk about often is water soldier. And that's because it's got some great elements to this story that if you're unfamiliar with, I'll try and do it justice as best I can in a slide or two. And the quick version of this story is that this is a great example of a species that it pops up for the first time in Ontario, not known to be occurring anywhere else in the wild in North America. And so was first found in just a little bit east of where I am today in Peterborough in the Trent Severn waterway. Not far from Havelock, if you're familiar with that part of the province. I'll try and cursor over the general area if you're kind of unfamiliar. So east of Rice Lake, here north of Lake Ontario. And so, species first pops up, becomes very quick and apparent, obviously, that this is a rapidly reproducing species. And as we kind of go through the first few years of our knowledge on the species and the rapid response that entails in that area, we start to recognize how more widely distributed the species is, maybe than we first respected and understood. And in kind of digging and working with our partners and those who are knowledgeable about the species, we realized that especially in southwestern Ontario here, we're starting to see quite a few private ponds and kind of individual examples of this species popping up. And so what you're looking at here is a printout of EDMAPS, the Early Detection Distribution Mapping System. So I'd encourage you to Google EDMAPS if you're unfamiliar with it. It's a great tool to tell us where a species has been reported in Ontario. And what you're looking at here is a printout of their distribution map. And all of those icons in red are previous reports that have been eradicated or removed and controlled. So, this is really, although there's a lot of points on this map, more than of course we all like, it's really encouraging to see that there's been a tremendous response. And this tremendous response has been coordinated and led by the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters through their Invading Species Awareness Program. So a very, very big tip of the cap to them and the Ministry of Natural, or the former Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, for supporting their control efforts in there. So what I did want to do with this picture is just kind of paint a quick little picture for, although the initial detection happening in the Trent Severn waterway in the eastern part of the province, the realization very quickly came about within just a few years about how widely distributed this plant species had become. And a great example of rapid response happening to work with those local landowners through the OFAH to address those populations. And why is this a story that's relevant to horticulture? Well, of course, this is, it's a water garden species, a little bit more niche than many of the most common, white water lilies or yellow pond lilies, or species that may be the usual suspects you think of when you think of what's available to put in my water garden, but still, certainly available at that time in southwestern Ontario and across Ontario. And so, no surprise, I guess, that it had become fairly widely utilized, or relatively speaking, at that time. And so, once the realization came how invasive this is and how problematic this species had become, quick response was needed. So this is a great example of a species, the power of the horticulture pathway, and why it's so important to be able to address this pathway to have a positive outcome here for invasive species. And so the Invasive Species Act, as it now stands, with water soldier now included as of after 2015, enables the banning or the prohibition of sale and trade of water soldier for the first time. So a new regulatory tool that can at least support the turn off the tap, if you will, of distributing this plant across the province. Well, again, we try and turn back time a little bit and have groups like OFH leading the charge on addressing the established populations. And so, again, a quick hat tip here to OFH. They've run a number of webinars with local landowners, especially in that Trent Severn waterway portion of the province, to help them understand what are their options in terms of supporting control and how can they kind of fit their cog into a broader wheel here of water soldier control. And so with memes on the mind, I think this is a good example here of how it started and how it's going. So with Water Soldier, another good organism in trade here being goldfish in the pond. And of course, in this setting, does it look as problematic as perhaps it would be out in the natural environment? Of course not. But I think, many well-intentioned and good-natured water gardeners not necessarily realizing how problematic it can be, as indicated on the image on the right here. So something to keep in mind, I think, one from my perspective, arguably the best case study of what happens with a water garden plant or just a species more broadly within horticulture. What happens when it jumps outside of the intended space and into our natural environment, and how problematic that can become. And to look forward a little bit as we're talking about the kind of regulatory capacity here, when we're thinking about policy implications and what tools are available to us right now. Just wanted to do a quick note because in case you'd missed it, everybody's busy in the spring and summer. In April 2021, so in April of this year, we did see a new post on the Environmental Registry of Ontario related to the Ontario Invasive Species Act, and this was floating the idea of a suite of new species to potentially be regulated. So these species are not regulated now as of yet, but they do have the potential to be regulated in Ontario, which would be a great step. And many of these have linkages into organisms in trade and thus kind of the fringes of horticulture. They're not kind of the key species that I talked about earlier, the Bradford bears and the ivies and such. Of course, it's a delicate balance in terms of figuring out how a species is regulated and how it can be kind of strategically addressed. And it's not to say that adding a species to a list in its own right necessarily gives us the outcome, of course, we all want, which is fewer invasive species out on the landscape and jumping out of trade and into the natural environment. But there are linkages here, important linkages to horticulture and organisms in trade. So I wanted to emphasize that and just make you aware of it. So we have marbled crayfish. Maybe more important to the horticulture audience would be yellow floating heart, another good example of another good pond candidate species, good in quotes, not from my perspective. Fanwort is another one. It's a little bit more niche, but one species with linkages into horticulture or aquatic gardening, or even just kind of keeping ponds, aquarium builders as well, and a few species of knotweeds too, with some varieties beyond just the usual suspect of Japanese knotweed. So very encouraged to see those. So again, those are not regulated right now, but they are proposed as potential species to be regulated, so under the ISA. So, encouraged to see that, and just wanted to make note of it in case it didn't catch your radar. And I just want to use this opportunity to, do a quick call to action here, because I think these ERO postings, the Environmental Registry of Ontario, gives people within Ontario an opportunity just to continue to flag that, if it is a near and dear issue to your heart, horticulture and invasive species, and how can we kind of move the needle of progress forward? This is a great opportunity for public consultation that the next time these come around, would encourage everyone and try and, share within your network if you can. If you see it appropriate to, use this opportunity to raise to the province interest in the subject matter and wanting to work collaboratively to advance the cause of it more. So that's the policy perspective. A quick note as well, of course, there are federal regulations within Canada. We're kind of presenting this webinar within the context of Ontario, but there are other implications to organisms in trade through regulation at the federal level. Most notably through Fisheries and Oceans Canada, some important regulations there about prohibited species that I encourage you to check out if that's maybe a line of thinking you're interested in. But did want to make note, I guess, of the ISA and the importance of that within the context of today's conversation. And so, that's it in terms of the policy framework, but I did want to make a quick note as well here for you about just some other opportunities for collaboration that other groups and organizations are partaking in. Really trying to push the needle forward here on the buying engagement and buy-in here for a collaborative approach. And two I wanted to make note of, it's not to say that these are the exclusive two. The Canadian Council on Invasive Species has a great national voluntary code of conduct for the ornamental horticulture industry. A really nice guide that producers of plant material within the horticulture industry can have a look at, sign up for, and kind of make the pledge. to address invasive species through this industry and pathway. A really important voice at this table, of course, being horticulture and the producers and industry more broadly. And so any actions and programs and steps that would provide us an opportunity to engage them a little bit more is certainly a welcome one. So I'd encourage you to check it out either via the link there, or if you just Google CCIS code of conduct, I think it's like the first Google hit that'll pop up for you. So encourage you to check it out and see if that's something that speaks to you and your interests. And the other quick plug I'd like to do for another collaborative program that definitely gives us an opportunity to advance the collective cause a bit more here is the WWF and Carolinian Canada Coalition's partnership in the zone. I don't want to steal any thunder from our later speakers here, but did want to do a quick plug for the In the Zone program, a great opportunity to link up those who are interested in non-invasive gardening and native plant gardening for the many kind of co-benefits it provides, of course, to our environment and certainly economy as well, and those who produce those plants. And so did want to make this opportunity to give a quick plug for that program. You can check it out by Googling Carolinian Canada in the zone, or just caroliniancanada.ca/zone to check them out a little bit further. Wanted to do a quick plug and thanks for checking that out. And so with that said, I wanted to transition over, in the spirit of collaboration here and kind of collective action around invasive species and horticulture, I wanted to turn the mic over to Colleen. And Colleen Cirillo joins us today from Toronto. And Colleen, if you can give me a second here, I'm going to pass over the control over to you of the slides, and away you go. Okay, the mouse should be yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Colin. Don't worry, you're not going to see my big head through the whole thing. I just wanted to say a quick hello, and then I'm going to go back into covering up my camera and get into details of the Horticulture Outreach Collaborative, which I'm going to refer to as HOC because the name is too long, and the most popular of our products, which is the Grow Me Instead. And just want to say too, I saw that there were a number of people that have been involved in HOC and Grow Me Instead on the webinar today, and just want to say thank you so much for all your support over the years. We've been working on this pathway since 2009, so thank you. So back in 2009, a bunch of ecologists, people working in conservation in the Greater Toronto area were lamenting two things. One, the increasing obvious spread of garden plants into natural areas, including Toronto's ravines, and also the lack of availability of locally sourced and grown native plants. We decided we wanted to address the horticultural pathway of invasive plants, but we didn't know what we wanted to be. We didn't have a name, we didn't have a home. Around the same time, a new amazing province-wide organization, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, was just starting up. So we landed with them, and I'm forever grateful that they took us in, so we didn't have to start up a new organization. We became a committee of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council back in January 2010. So we address the horticulture pathway. A pathway is simply a way in which invasive species are introduced or moved from one region or ecosystem to another, either deliberately or accidentally. There's often or always no ill intent. People bring plants in to garden with, plants that they're familiar with. My ancestors came from Europe and brought over plants. They're big gardeners. Probably the same can be said for most of you. And there was no ill intent. There was just a lack of awareness that these plants would have a negative impact on the local ecology. But more and more we know that to be true. So we definitely need to take action on this pathway. Horticulture is a well-established and a generous pathway. According to Canadian Food Inspection Agency, 50% of known invasive plants in Canada have been introduced through horticulture. Research in the States shows that 82% of invasive woody species in North America have been introduced through horticulture. Often what makes a plant a good choice for the garden also contributes to its invasiveness. I'll just give a couple examples. If a plant is adaptable, it's a habitat generalist. If it's easy to care for, it can stand its own and outcompete other plants. If it's easy to propagate, it probably has a high reproductive rate. If it attracts birds, it can be a high seed dispersal plant. An example would be the olives or burning bush. So, and the last example is pest resistance. Sometimes we bring in a plant into our gardens because it's resistant to pests, but that also means that it doesn't have predators to keep it in check, which can lead to it becoming invasive. We now have many years worth of data to show that some garden plants do escape gardens and move into nearby natural areas. And more recently, we have mounting evidence that landscapes filled with non-native plants, so even if they're not invasive, if they're just non-native, they are sterile in a way. They support far fewer insects and birds. The goals of our little committee, and I just want to say, sorry, if I can go back for a minute, the founding group members include representatives from Toronto Region Conservation Authority, Credit Valley Conservation, Landscape Ontario, and the Invasive Species Awareness Program, Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and Ontario Streams. But now we have representatives from many more NGOs, from government, and from industry. So our goals are listed here, and they're quite lofty, more aspirational than practical in some ways. So the first one, though, I think is really important, and we've kind of fallen short recently on this just because we don't have any dedicated staff members and everybody is busy with their jobs and working on HOC off the sides of their desks. But really the most important thing is to foster relationships between the different groups. So ecologists and horticulturalists are the two big groups. And I think early on I thought there would be a lot of common ground, but there was a bit of tension, and there always has been a bit of like give and take on both sides. And the Grow Me Instead guide is an absolute example of collaboration and compromise to get a good product. So even though we've had to compromise on a few species that perhaps ecologists wanted or perhaps horticulturalists wanted, we still have overall a really good product. And that is an example of our collaboration. We have done a good job of identifying many of the invasive and potentially invasive horticultural plants in Ontario, and those are listed in the guides. The other two there are definitely ones we still need to really work on. Those are the big, lofty goals that we have that we will continue to work on through the years. Activities and accomplishments are, I think, we've done quite a bit. We were more active at the start in 2009 and a few years afterwards. That picture there is taken from BC, actually, not Ontario, but I go to visit my family out in BC and they take me to these natural areas. They're very proud to show them off. Often I see many of the same invasives that we have in Ontario through these natural areas. Anyway, back to our activities and accomplishments listed there. We really have focused on outreach and education. And previously to HOC, I was working on outreach and education for the clients or the consumers of garden plants. And then HOC, I really wanted to get at the more professional audience. However, we found that everything we did was applicable to both the consumers or clients as well as the professional or more industry audience. So we have done presentations for all sorts of groups in conservation and horticulture, people who are making a living in horticulture, and people that are learning about horticulture and just starting out. We haven't done too much research on our own, but early on in 2009, we visited retail and wholesale operations. We spoke with growers and managers, and we used our insights to help guide the direction of our committee. From 2010 to 2013, we did a number of interviews and nursery visits. In 2011, this was a lot of fun, and I'd love to do something like this again. I had done my master's at University of Waterloo, so I was able to tap into some students over there, and we found a student that was co-supervised by myself and Professor Stephen Murphy, and he created a questionnaire that was reviewed by the ethics office at the university and distributed to a number of growers and sellers. Also in 2016, Ontario Invasive Plant Council, which I'll now refer to as OIPC, sent out a questionnaire to tour attendees and HOC members, again to gauge people's activities and opinions about the horticulture pathway and what we should be doing in Ontario. So we have done some research into industry awareness and attitudes and to sales of invasive plants. And then we've done more literature review related to the spread and extent of invasive garden plants in natural areas. We did a number of tours, for 3 years back in, I think it was 2010, 2012, and 2016, and those were really popular, and I'd love to do those again. I'll speak more about the tours in a moment. And the Nursery Outreach Recognition Program and the Grow Me Instead I will also speak to. Those are definitely more popular programs. So some of the insights from our time doing interviews and sending out surveys are listed here. So what was really kind of surprising to me at first when I was so naive and just learning about the horticulture world was just how plants are treated in many ways as commodities and brought in from all over the world, and often little attention paid to the source of those plants. And this is for the big players in horticulture, in the nursery trade. And I also discovered that many people in the industry are aware of the issue of invasive plants and conducting their own research. And when I would ask them about the kind of research being conducted, I would often hear about research into sterile plants, so to try and make invasive plants not invasive, which I think most of us would agree is really not where we want to go. We have already enough sterile landscapes in Ontario, especially Southern Ontario, and we need to bring back life. We need sustainable landscapes. But that was some of the research that I heard about. And remember, these are insights from quite a few years ago now, so please keep that in mind. And it would be wonderful to try and get information, more current information on attitudes and behaviors. I also heard from industry that they felt that it was the responsibility of trade associations and provincial government to address the issue of invasive garden plants, and that if change was going to come, they would require scientific proof, legislation, and they definitely wanted to be consulted of any changes, which completely makes sense. No one wants to be told what to do. They want to be involved if the change is going to include them. Some other insights. We heard that many store owners were supportive of in-store brochures, plant tags, and verbally suggesting alternatives. However, they were not so supportive at the time of certification, which was interesting because we were going to pursue a certification program, but when we heard that retail managers were not so interested in it because they didn't believe there was a demand for it, and they also believed it would be extra work, we held off on that. Other bodies have attempted certification, and it would be interesting to see how successful those are. So the Native Plant Society of Saskatchewan, maybe 10 or so years ago, did one. The city of Calgary, also 10 or so years ago, tried a certification program. And we heard about from Colin the Canadian Council on Invasive Species Code of Conduct. Growers also told us that demand drives production, and that they would likely not change the species that they grow unless demand was demonstrably high and/or legislation forced them to do so. The final bit that I'll share with you is that we were told growers and sellers were concerned that if legislation came in, they would lose a lot of money from their big sellers, which at the time were 3 that I'll mention were Norway Maple, Periwinkle, and English Ivy. So definitely I'd love to do more research so we have some more updated information, and also to reestablish the relationships, because we've been a little, we haven't been doing that as much as we should be. Ecological research, there has been quite a bit done recently here in Toronto and also further abroad on the occurrence, spread, and impact of invasive garden plants. In Toronto, we see, as an example, Norway Maple, which is featured here on the slide, really doing very well, and a lot of the regeneration we see happening among woody plants is invasive Norway Maple. We have University of Toronto student Anke Dong, who in 2016 resurveyed ravine plots 40 years after they had been surveyed by the Toronto field naturalists. And she found that the regeneration is mostly non-native, the regeneration that's happening among trees, and that Norway Maple more than doubled in prevalence. That's just one example of many. So we have a lot of information to share with people who might be wondering why we're spending our time focusing on the horticulture pathway. A number of cities about 10 to 12 years ago did urban forest studies, and it was really quite surprising to see just how dominant the non-native species are many of which are in the horticultural trade, including burning bush and the honeysuckles and Norway Maple. Faunal associations, Douglas Talame, we're all familiar with him most likely, he's the big player here. He's the one who's taught us so much about how essential native plants are right at home in our industrial parks, our schoolyards, our backyards, our front yards, because this is where we need to restore nature right at home. So he has spurred a lot of research being done at the University of Delaware where he is, but also elsewhere, even right here at home at the University of Toronto, where a few years ago, Eric Davies studied insect and bird diversity in native and non-native trees in multiple Toronto sites and found that, no surprise, native trees hosted a greater diversity and number of insects, and that birds would visit those native trees for longer than they did the non-native trees. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there because of time. But we do have a list of other research. If you're interested, you can get in touch with me. One last thing I'll say about Norway Maple, it's been here since the 1750s in North America, but it only supports a small number of generalist native insects. And it is considered invasive in parts of BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and PEI. So you can see that this isn't a problem that just Ontario is facing. We're facing it across the country. The tours back in 2010, 2012, and 2016, HOC, with a lot of support from the Ontario Invasive Plant Council and others, delivered these tours, which were very popular. We had a mix of growers, nursery owners, ecologists, landscape architects and designers, media, government reps, and students attend the tours. We visited High Park, Rattray Marsh in Mississauga, Royal Botanical Garden, and AVK Nurseries, to name a few of the locations. It's one thing to discuss the issue of horticultural invasives. It's quite another to go into the natural areas and see the spread. So I think it was a real eye-opener for many. It led to a number of articles and even some TV media. And a neighbor of mine got in touch and we were able to produce, he offered to, for free, which was an incredibly generous offer, produce a number of Grow Me Instead videos. So these tours were, I think, an exceptional opportunity to get together and discuss the issue and really show people firsthand what is going on in our natural areas. Now on to our most popular, most well-known product, the Grow Me Instead guide. Here are some old pictures. The one on the right is the old Southern Ontario one. We have a new one, which I'll show you a picture of shortly. So this is a guide that identifies common garden plants with invasive tendencies and then non-invasive plants with comparable growth and requirements and patterns. It contains photos and descriptions of all the plants, and we have a mix of ground covers, wildflowers, grasses, trees, shrubs, vines, and aquatic plants. There are two versions, one for Northern Ontario and another for Southern Ontario. And there is a digital guide available in English and French, which is a very popular feature on the OIPC website. The guide has been embraced by a large and diverse audience, and it's considered essential reading for many college students studying horticulture in Ontario. In addition to the guide, we developed a Grow Me Instead presentation, which has been delivered countless times since 2010. And like I said, the videos, and you'll see in the next slide, we also had Grow Me Instead seed packets. This was not a new idea. We didn't create it. We borrowed it from others. We first became familiar with guides available in BC, Oregon, Sydney, New South Wales, South Africa, and various places in the United States, including the Midwest. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network has all sorts of incredible resources if you're interested. We were given permission from BC and Oregon to use their title and their design, which helped us out a lot. And I'll go to the next slide. I wanted to mention that a number of provinces have Grow Me Instead, including British Columbia, Yukon, Alberta, and Manitoba. So here you will see, oh, sorry, this is still the older guide, but here are some stats on how on the distribution of the guide and the website visits, seed packets, and bookmarks. So the numbers are of guides produced and mostly distributed. Some of those 85,000 for the southern guides are probably in people's offices or somewhere stashed in their homes because COVID hit just as we printed a number of the new version 3 of the Southern Ontario Guide. So some of those are not yet distributed. So many partners have assisted with the guide. They've provided content, images, and funding. And you can see all the different contributors. If you go to the guide, you'll see the acknowledgement page. I'd like to just give a huge shout out to Kate, if she's on the line, from the Invasive Species Awareness Program, who coordinated the 3rd edition in 2019 and 2020. We couldn't have done it without her, and her design colleague from ISAP that made the design look so good. If you would like to download the guide, you can see the link there. If you'd like hard copies to distribute, please get in touch with the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. Just quickly, this is how the guide works. We will show you the invasive plants, and then we will show you the alternatives. In case you're wondering where these 3 ground covers are invasive, they are invasive in a number of provinces, not entirely those provinces, but at least in parts of those provinces. So BC, Ontario, PEI, and Newfoundland. And here you see the alternatives. Now, I've presented some of these alternatives because these happen to be some of my favorites, and they are the native alternatives. But as I mentioned earlier, or I think I mentioned earlier, if not, I'll mention it now, we do have some non-native alternatives as well, because we really wanted the guide to be practical. We really wanted people to get it and use it. So some of these native plants are still hard to come by, especially outside the big urban areas. So we wanted plants that were easily available and that were still non-invasive. We wanted some plants that are familiar to people. People might not be as familiar with our native plants, which is kind of crazy that people aren't familiar with native plants, but that's the way it is. And so we wanted familiar, easily accessible, non-native plants. So non-invasive plants. So that's why we have some non-natives in the guide as well. Our Nursery Outreach program, we got a generous funding from the Invasive Species Centre in 2012 and 2013 to run this Nursery Outreach and Recognition project. And it was a ton of fun to work on. I got to visit a number of nurseries, mostly small and medium-sized nurseries, many of them still family-run. Unfortunately, a lot of those are gone now, and there are subdivisions in place where those used to exist. But anyway, back to this program, we had about 18 nurseries that participated, and we asked them, the garden centers, to prominently feature the guide and to promote the sale of non-invasive plants featured in the guide. Participating centers had the posters and header cards up in their nurseries, and they distributed the guides at their cash counters. We would give them everything they needed to participate in the program. We also offered these centers presentations for their staff and their customers. Most did not take us up on that offer, but we made the offer regardless. And we would promote their businesses on the OIPC website and in any presentations that we did. This was a great program. I really enjoyed working on it. And I think there's definitely potential to do more with nurseries. We didn't have any luck reaching out to the big box stores back in 2012, 2013, but the medium size and smaller size ones were quite happy to participate. Where are we right now in 2021? I want to wrap up quickly to give David time to discuss the great project he's been working on. We've just started a conversation with the Canadian Council of Invasive Species to see if we can encourage a national conversation, because as I've mentioned, this is an issue. The horticultural pathway is an issue across the country. We are also just starting to have conversations with some of the big players that have had success with big box stores. As an example, Canadian Wildlife Federation has worked with Home Depot to have native plants available in some of the Home Depot stores. And then another example is World Wildlife Fund and Carolina, Canada, that have worked with Loblaws to have native plants available in those stores. So what I'm trying to have conversations to say, well, look, this is wonderful that native plants are now available. How about removing the next door invasive plant from your shelf? So leveraging the great relationships that have been formed over many years between these big NGOs and big box stores to get that complimentary message of invasive plants to them. We're always supporting groups, big and small, that want to amplify, that want to share the Grow Me Instead message. We do presentations, we share our presentation, we offer these guides for free. We're really still heavily promoting that 3rd edition of the guide. It's only a year old, and it's a great resource. We need to get it out there. And if there's anyone on the webinar today that has the capacity to help us update the Northern Ontario guide and the French guide, please get in touch. We know that we have not been able to get to these 2 activities, and we really want to. We know that this is an issue in Northern Ontario more and more so, and that guide has not been updated at all. So it needs updating for sure. A little bit of information on inspiration from outside Ontario. So you'll see here, there's a few pictures I put up there. The first one on the left, see that plant tag? That is from New York. And it's a plant tag to say that that species you're about to pick up in the store is a restricted species and it can be harmful to the environment. So some jurisdictions, basically there are different approaches and tools in different jurisdictions. Colin talked a bit about an opportunity here in Ontario for legislation that might help us along. In the states, south of the border, we have seen various states implement legislation. As an example, Delaware in 2021 passed legislation that restricts the sale of 37 garden plants. Of course, a number of organizations have been involved in education. On the top left, you see there a picture of a cell phone with the Landscape Alternatives app, and that's offered by the Midwest Invasive Plant Council, network. That is an incredible tool, and how wonderful it would be to have a tool like that for Ontario, Grow Me Instead. So many organizations and government bodies are involved in education. There are so many examples from around the world because the horticultural pathway is a global issue. And down at the bottom is another example of just a small little thing that people can do, because we do hear from people all the time feeling like this is an issue that they really care about and they want to do something about it. So the Midwest Invasive Plant Network created this little bit of text, a little card that people could copy off of they could download a sheet with a number of these cards on it and bring them to their nurseries, just to let the nursery owner, the nursery staff know that that customer has discovered invasive plants for sale and that there are alternatives. So that's something that HOC, the easy thing that HOC could put together, that OIPC could put together, or you could do on your own. So these are just a few examples of the many that are out there, examples that we might want to pursue. There are a lot of overarching questions like, what are the most effective approaches and tones to curtailing the proliferation of invasive garden plants in Ontario? Which approach, which products will have the fastest and biggest impact? Because we know that this problem is huge and only getting worse. And really, if we really address this with all that we can in a collaborative way, we are going to be addressing the 2 biggest issues that face humanity, that is climate change and habitat or biodiversity loss. Who are the key players? So having conversations about that again. And what is HOC's role in this big picture? I think that is my last slide. I just wanted to thank some of the organizations that have been involved from the start. This is by no means a complete list, so I apologize if you're part of an organization that is not represented here, but these are some of the big ones that have been around from the start. Thank you so much, and I hope that we can boost our efforts in the near future. Now I'm going to pass it on to Dave from Invasive Species Centre, and he's going to talk to you about a really cool biodiverse garden that he's been working on. Thank you so much.
Hi, hello there. Thank you very much for that awesome presentation. Those were really good to hear from. So I'm just going to quickly talk about a project that we have been working on. I'm just going to turn my camera off so you guys don't have to see my face. So the project that we've been working on has been focused on a biodiversity garden in the last little while. in Sault Ste. Marie. Sorry, I'll go back to this initial slide. At the Invasive Species Centre, we've actually been trying to put forward a biodiversity garden for quite some time now. And this is sort of the project of how we started and how we're doing now. So just a little bit to go over. We're going to talk about project summaries, garden design, and the next steps. So one of the things that we found when we're started to propose this sort of garden design is really four main pillars, I guess you would call them, in order to make a successful garden pitch. Location and partners were one. Having appropriate funding was another. Ongoing maintenance was another issue that we had come across. And what was the purpose and the goals of these types of your garden or your garden proposal that you wanted to set up? So originally we had attempted, our first attempt was in 2017, and we wanted to get some conservation authorities on board, and we thought the Fort Creek Conservation Area in Sault Ste. Marie was going to be a really a good place because there's a lot of activity out there. So we had an initial funding source. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was just sort of a small amount of seed money to get going. And when we at the Invasive Species Centre thought about our purpose and our goals, were to really promote native species and promote education through things like Grow Me Instead and several other types of guides. And one thing we found out was, well, we didn't really have enough funding. The Conservation Authority said it was a great idea, but they didn't really have an area specific that a garden could go, because they tend to be, that specific Conservation Authority tends to be more of a place where a lot of people take their dogs. It's a forested walkway. So there wasn't really any landscaping areas that we can really talk about using a garden there. So we didn't have any plans on long-term maintenance and to prevent it from turning into a weed garden. So those are some of the things that we found out initially, where we started to move on. So the next attempt was to think about having it at the Great Lakes Forest Research Center in the Arboretum. We thought that the ground staff at the GLFC would be able to do some watering and weeding, as well as the staff at the Invasive Species Centre. We had some more funding available in 2018 to propose a garden, and if anyone had any questions or wanted to know more, they can always come to the Invasive Species Centre in order to actually find out any information and more information we can provide them. Moving forward, after checking with the Great Lakes Forest Research Center, they suggested that it wouldn't be the greatest spot because it's not very, there's not a lot of foot traffic through the Arboretum, and they wouldn't have, their staff wouldn't have time to be able to do a lot of the gardening and helping. So those are two things that we came across, which would be sort of difficult. So in 2021, we came across, for our 10th year anniversary, we were thinking we have almost $10,000 for initial seed money, and we wanted to get together with, to try and find another partner in order to work with. And one of the things we came up with is a great place for educational storage would be a library. Clerg Park down by the Sault Ste. Marie waterfront has access to the Sault Ste. Marie Hub Trail, which is right there. It's heavily used by lots of different people. The library would be a great place to host any sort of reading material on invasive plants and gardening. They like to do different initiatives in order to promote different educational ideas. And so they were actually very happy to work with us, and we were able to get this project underway. As well as we brought on the city of Sault Ste. Marie. Since the city, since Sault Ste. Marie Public Library and the city of Sault Ste. Marie worked together on the maintenance of the library gardens, the planters that are outside the library, as well as another garden that they had out front. The city of Sault Ste. Marie said it wouldn't be that much extra in order to maintain several gardens with their summer students that they bring on. So they were actually very helpful in providing expertise in order to either maintain with watering and help with weeding to move forward. So we were able to check off all the boxes, as well as the library was looking for partners to help out with, they wanted to have additional sort of reading features in this garden. So they were really great in providing some extra funding. So we were able to put together our funding dollars in order to make a really nice area. So like I said, the biodiversity garden has been put together by the Invasive Species Centre, as along with the city of Sault Ste. Marie and the Sault Ste. Marie Public Library. So we're working with these partners in the capacity, whereas we have the project management is being led through the library initiative. They're going to host a lot of the educational material as a repository for gardening, as well as the city of Sault Ste. Marie are going to help out with plant acquisition, as well as planting and maintenance. Their sign department said that they were able to assist with signage as well, so that was really helpful. And the Invasive Species Centre was providing initial seed money, as well as the garden design and plant discussions or plant choices for those areas. These talks really got underway in the spring of 2021 during the pandemic, and we had a lot of back and forth emails going through, as well as we got to meet outside in the snow way back in the end of February. And we were able to get together these groups and sort of discuss what our goals were and what their goals were. So we, like I said before, we added the $10,000, and the Sault Ste. Marie Public Library was able to add more areas in order to get it going. So our big educational goal was really to promote the gardening as a beneficial and educational group in order to use different guides in order to help people choose that, yes, your backyards can be successful, it can be biodiverse, and can be you know, great places for pollinators to go to, and great places for green infrastructure for management of different, either promoting management for caterpillars in order to grow, or as well as bringing in different bees and butterfly populations to those areas. So those are some of the educational goals that we're hoping for, and to allow people to use those types of settings in order to allow them to learn from this area. Some of our partner had the same goals. However, they had some requirements that we wanted to meet. So they wanted to integrate some of the initial, or the landscape that they had in front of their building. They wanted to incorporate some trees, as well as have us plant some additional trees into the landscape in order to make it really a beautiful spot for people to want to go to and want to sit and read, or want to just sort of do a small nature walk just off the hub trail. And so it was sort of promoted to be that kind of a situation. They also made a small request that have some sort of a natural barrier towards where their staff parking lot is, so that they can sort of hide that area. So landscaping can be used for multiple different duties as well as education, but it can also be used to hide certain areas that you don't want to promote. So in looking for the location, we had two choices, the south side of the library or the northeast side of the library. The south side of the library we were looking at because it was sort of a blank canvas. And we had originally thought that that would be a great place to have sort of a reading area. It's a little bit farther away from the main road. However, we found out that when we actually looked at the property that it would be a little bit too hard to dig there, because a lot of that area is reclaimed soil. So since it's so close to the water, it would be a lot of concrete and things like that underneath. So we chose the northeast side of the property, just so as it is the soil's better, it's easier to grow there, and it's a little bit more visible. So that's why we chose to go over there. We used several different reference guides. The Northern Grow Me Instead guide was very helpful in order to choose plants, trees, and shrubs, as well as we took a look at the Southern Grow Me Instead guide for ideas, and Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, as well as Ontario Trees and Shrubs, in order to choose species specifics that would be well in the air, that would grow well in the area, as well as to know which were shade tolerant or which were sun tolerant, and go from there. For the educational signs in this area, we wanted to post these in areas around each individual plant, so that people would know which groupings of plants, what they were, and where you can find out more information, as well as several large signs in order to promote people to do a walkthrough to learn more. We also decided that we would print these signs in 4 different languages. Most of the species have Indigenous significance, so we thought it would be good to have an Indigenous language, as well as the scientific and common names, both in French and English, for this area. So this is the area that we sort of chose. As you can see, there's the Hub Trail monuments, as well as the Centennial Monument. And on the picture on the top right-hand side, and it will move between the 2 benches and flow. The pathway will flow towards the Sault Ste. Marie Library sign and sort of swing around to the entrance of the library. These are just sort of a blank canvas area and where we started, and that's where we're moving on in order to continue planting. So we also grabbed this image from Google Earth in order to help design the area moving forward. So this was the eventual plan that we came up with. We broke it down into 5 different garden zones, as well as areas that the library had asked if we could provide different, like a reading pergola, as well as areas where they can have bench seating around certain trees, and then move from there. This is just, again, the photo just overlaid over top of a satellite image. And in order to plan out the gardens, we sort of just took the zones that we wanted and then sort of extrapolated onto which gardens would have which plants available in it. So we used, one of the big things was this garden zone number 1 would be the entrance off of the hub trail. We wanted it to be big and flashy in order to get people to walk through here. And we also, this is part of the garden where they wanted to provide the area where you wouldn't be able to see the parking. So we have a lot of trees in the background to sort of hide that parking area, but we wanted to have lots of flowers in the foreground so that you can understand different growing styles. So lots of clone flowers, Rebecca, so your brown-eyed Susans, as well as foxgloves, wild geraniums in certain places. That grow underneath things like serviceberry, ninebark, and eastern white cedar, as well as eastern red cedar. We thought would be really great areas for here. In garden zone number 2, these areas sort of are pressed up against the hub trail sign. And so we wanted to sort of soften those areas if you're looking at the back of that sign. So that's why we decided to go with some shrubbing, staghorn sumac, which would be a very nice and very feather-like plant right on the back of the sign. So it actually softens the concrete hardness of that monument that's in front of it. And we thought that would be a good choice. We're also using lots of plants that are very sun tolerant, that really enjoy the sun, because this area will also be very sun baked. So we try to choose flowers that can handle some sun. So garden zone number 3 and 4 are actually at the beginning of the entrance of the library. So they sort of direct people from the hub trail towards the library entrance as a sort of a flow tactic. And it is a very sort of shaded area, so we are able to choose a little bit more shade tolerant plants, which are really cool. And I think often understated because they can be very small, but very beautiful when they do actually flower. So we were able to have these garden zones 3 and 4 in order to be a little bit more shade tolerant, but also very pretty right off of the library boulevard. So like I had mentioned here, this is another image of garden zone 3. Garden zone 5 was actually added on by the library. There was some specific worries that they had because they have the Sault Ste. Marie Public Library as such a large sign right behind the garden. So the garden really couldn't have any flowers or any plants that were over, 2 feet or 50 centimeters to 75 centimeters tall, because it would obstruct the sign from the road. So they wanted that to be prominent. But they still wanted to have this garden here as an area that came right out of their reading pergola that they want. And so we were able to find some low-lying plants that enjoy the sun and will hopefully do well in this area. So these were the trees that we actually were able to obtain recently. So they're sort of scattered throughout the different garden zones, but they're also trees that we were able to obtain through the city. The city was actually very gracious in order to allow us to add these trees onto their larger purchase order. So we were able to get all these trees for actually a very, very reasonable price, which was really great. I think all these trees cost just over $1,500, which is awesome that they were able to allow us to include these in their larger purchase order. And so we're able to plant those trees sort of beginning fall time to allow them to root and overwinter. In The flower list that we have here, we have a lot of the flowers that we got from the Grow Me Instead guides. We actually used those guides very specifically in order to use them as a technique that you can get a very great flower selection in order to use for different gardens. So we used a lot of those flowers, and we're going to be propagating them this year. We're going to be buying seeds or root bundles, and hopefully grow them in greenhouses before we actually plant them in the spring of 2022. The ISC was mostly responsible for providing a lot of the plant ideas, the pathways, that's what the funding was going towards, as well as some of the masonry that had to be put in place. So the pathways are actually used most often in the city. It's sort of a crushed slate, and they were able to provide it to us for relatively cheap. And it worked out really well that they also have a very good mulch system at the Sault Ste. Marie dump. And if we needed mulch, they can provide it to us for a relatively low cost as well. Like I had said before, the city of Sault Ste. Marie was great at providing sources of trees and plants, as well as allowing us to grow some of our plants in their greenhouses at Bellevue Park over the springtime in order to be ready for planting, which the city actually took into consideration, and they actually will be planting the initial plants using those plans above for the 2022 spring season. The Sault Ste. Marie Public Library, they are providing additional funding for their reading pergola. They wanted a 16 by 16 pergola with benches in it, as well as several trees that they'll be putting benches around. This is just an example of one of the benches down below, and they're hoping that they can have a very excellent encouragement of reading in those areas, as well as to run different children's programs in those areas as well, so that they can have small groups of outdoor reading for different children's groups that they run at the public library. So sort of the next steps that we're moving on to. So we have great partners, we have great location, we have a plan. Now it's just down to the actual nitty gritty of, doing final locates so that we can plant trees, so that we can plan our pathways. We have a draft budget list for most of the pathways, the mulching, and the signage. And we're moving forward with those currently, as well as we are looking at key milestones for the phases that we are going to be putting forward before winter time. So there have been some trees that have already been planted. We have purchased the seeds and the roots that will be propagating for the 2022 spring season, as well as we'll begin preparations on starting to create the pathways through that area. I think within 2 months, in October is when they'll be starting that, as well as the production of signs. So the City of Sault Ste. Marie Library was actually looking at additional funding for these reading gazebos. So that funding through the TD Friends of the Environment funding application is going through as we speak, and as well as some of the tree benches, they're going to be using that funding for those types of friendly environmental areas. So we're hoping that this area will be able to allow the library to have native gardens outside of their area, outside of the building, for educational purposes, but also as a resource for them to use and for the general public in order to utilize. as well as we were hoping to leverage possible areas that we can use with Sault Ste. Marie, such as Clean North in Sault Ste. Marie, the Horticulture Society of Sault Ste. Marie, as well as Algoma Master Gardeners and the Sault Ste. Marie naturalists in order to assist with anything that we might need, and hopefully that we'll be able to collaborate with them moving forward. So I wanted to thank everyone for sticking around for the last little bit of my presentation. And I think we'll head back to Colin with some questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. What a great example of kind of implementation, and starting with non-invasive gardening turns into a very big kind of community collaboration pretty quickly. So great to see that. Just to kind of jump forward and then jump backwards as we welcome Colleen as well back on camera. A quick plug, I know we're over time today, but thanks for hanging around if you're still here. If not, you can always check back on the recording at a later date, so no problem there. But a very quick hat tip here towards a few upcoming webinars. With the ISC's monthly webinar series, the next one for that series is going to be on the 21st. It's about invasive mussels and community science. So detecting mussels through citizen science and community science methods. And another webinar series which we're involved in coordinating is the Ontario Biodiversity Council webinar series. We've got a few great ones coming up. It's broader in terms of biodiversity, not just invasive species. Of course, we have a role to play there, but September 16th, there's a pair of great webinars, biodiversity in ag, biodiversity in forestry, and then on the 23rd rather, mainstream biodiversity within business. So really nice subject matter, different from horticulture, of course, which we're discussing today, but didn't want to let the opportunity slip to promote that quickly. So as I welcome back a few questions from the audience here, I'm going to scan through, and Colleen, I'll just get you started if you don't mind. Just a question from somebody here looking for some ideas and suggestions around accessing native plant material. If their local nursery, I guess, doesn't have that or isn't able to facilitate, any tips, I guess, on where they can go to find some of these plants that might be within the Grow Me Instead guide?
So I usually recommend, and maybe this person's already thought of this, but the North American Native Plant Society, their website is nanps.org, and they have a list of commercial growers. They also do plant sales, and this year, just like everyone else, they had to do it differently last year and this year. So they ended up doing a different type of sale as opposed to a big in-person sale. But if you're in the Greater Toronto area, you might be interested in their sales. If you're beyond that area, elsewhere in the province, you can still go to their website because they have a list of growers actually in various places in North America and certainly throughout Ontario. So that would be a good place to start. And then there are a number of Loblaw stores that did sell native plants this spring. I don't think they're still in the stores anymore. And the last place I'll mention is Home Depot, that some of those are working with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and you can purchase native plant kits. So those are free options for you.
Great options. The only one I'd add to that too that comes to mind now that you're jogging my memory would be the Carolinian Canada program that we mentioned there. There's some great resources on their website in terms of native plant retailers as well, beyond the ones that Colleen just mentioned. So promote that. Colleen, somebody's, if you could reiterate, looking for a printed copy of the Grow Me Instead guide, where can we direct them looking for those?
So the Ontario Invasive Plant Council has, I think their offices are still closed, just like many offices, but you can still get in touch with, I think it's Belinda or Connor. Why don't we say you could contact me, because I think that might be easiest, and then I'll make sure that you get the right person. So my email is simply colleen.cirillo@gmail.com, and then I can help you hook up with the right person at OIPC to get a guide or two. If you just want one or two and you're in the GTA, I can bring you some. I have some, but if you want a larger amount or you're farther afield, I'll help you reach the right OIPC person.
I was going to say, I think we have a couple copies at the Invasive Species Centre as well.
We do, yeah. So if you reply to this, the webinar email, we'll find you a copy. Just send over your name and mailing address, and we'll get you some. So just somebody plugging in the questions here, want to make up this opportunity as well. Somebody promoting native plant availability, a few great websites. Check out onplants, that's onplants.ca, OntarioPlants.ca, and NativePlants.ca. 3 great sources of information somebody's promoting here, so I wanted to send those along as well.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody here making the note, I think, Colleen, this might be best directed at you. Somebody making the note about, the value of promoting native plant gardens or invasive-free gardens in the front yard versus the backyard, just as a conversation starter with the neighbors. Not sure if you have any on that, but kind of a neat note.
Yeah, I love that idea. And here in my little neighborhood, I'll just mention a project that's all about that. And we have these little signs. It's called Project Swallowtail. It's a native plant project in West Toronto, and we're all just growing these native plants and distributing them for free to our neighbors and promoting native plants. A lot of our in-person events had to be canceled, but we really do like them up front, because especially in a very walkable community, that's where the conversations happen. You're walking your dog or your child and you just happen to see someone gardening in your front yard. So I think it's a great suggestion to get those native plants in the front yard and be happy to talk to people about them.
Somebody asking here about honeysuckles available in garden centers. Are all honeysuckles species that are available in garden centers invasive? Colleen, any thoughts or tips on that?
Most of the ones I see, yes, they are not our native honeysuckles, and they are, there's I think 3 or 4 of them that are invasive. We have a native honeysuckle called bush honeysuckle, which is a smaller specimen, and it's lovely with a small little yellow flower. But I don't tend to see that in the regular nurseries. The ones I banned myself from nurseries because I have hissy fits when I go. But the last few times I've been, I have seen still only invasive honeysuckles. But please correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. I would love to hear about our native honeysuckle being available in regular nurseries. I haven't seen it.
Another great tip I've heard from an HOC member there, Colleen, is just taking the stem of a plant, taking a cross section, having a look. If it's hollow, usually that's an indicator of an invasive species. That's a general rule of practice for Ontario, so please don't quote me, but that's a kind of quick and dirty field test for folks.
Okay, great.
Maybe a quick question here on HOC. Colleen, any particular backgrounds, or like how can somebody become involved in HOC? Is there any kind of entrance exam or any sort of qualifications that people need, or who are you looking for?
Anyone who's really passionate about the issue or wants to learn more about the issue. We're all just feeding off of one another, learning off of one another, learning from one another. Like I said, there's a mix of people with different backgrounds, and that's what makes it so, I think, special. So it wouldn't be as good if it was just like us ecologists or conservation-focused people speaking about the issue. It's a real mix of hobby gardeners, professional gardeners, people in the conservation world, people in the horticultural world, consultants, all sorts. We are not super active right now. Colin is extremely busy at the Invasive Species Centre, and he's co-chair, and I'm co-chair. I give as much as I can, but honestly, also we would love people that have some time to give. And I've been co-chair for a while, and I'm fine if someone wants to kick me off and decide to be co-chair with Colin. So if you're interested in learning more about the committee and potentially getting involved, please contact me. And even if you just want to get involved and learn for a while and be kind of a quiet participant, absolutely still please do get in touch. And then perhaps a certain project or at a certain time in the future, you'll become more active.
There's a couple notes in the questions here, Colleen. I'll just ignore that idea of you stepping aside. No way, Jose. But a couple questions here coming in around just kind of cool idea and fascination around the idea of labeling. Colleen, that was such a great example that I think was it Mippen? I'm sorry, I don't recall from your slide there, but just that idea of kind of just prompting that decision point, right? When someone's at that nursery. I'm not sure if there's any examples you could make, but yeah.
Most of the examples come from states where legislation is in place. So one I didn't mention was, oh God, one of the Northeast United States, their Home Depots now have ask for alternatives, big signs. And then like we had with our little outreach project, so you see the big signs, then you go close to the plant and you see a sign there saying, warning, or just like a cautionary note, this is a restricted plant. It's so wonderful to have those in the store prompts, because that's where people are making their decisions. I also know from a lot of people in my world and my family and a lot of my friends that aren't very plant aware, they actually aren't going in and seeking these invasive plants. They're just seeking a plant that's going to fit a particular spot in their garden. So it's really a matter of just getting them. They don't have a preconceived notion, oh, I want periwinkle or I want goutweed. They just want a ground cover. So if you can get them right when they're making that decision, I think that's so wonderful. That's why I really loved working on that nursery outreach and recognition program. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Maybe a call for action here. If there's any potential retailers on board here on the line still that maybe could be, you know, housing a small part of their counter with some HOC guides, would love to get them to you as a bit of a touch point there for people making maybe more non-invasive friendly decisions at the plant or retail level. Just one question though, maybe the last question here, is we're kind of well over time at this point, but question here about the role of the municipality. And David, maybe I'll start off and then go to you with kind of the specific example just about, you know, working through the library, but just what is the role of the municipality in this kind of conversation? And just, and Colleen, you're welcome to jump in too, but just from my perspective here, I think, you know, some of the best engagement we've had are with landscape design people who are maybe more traditionally trained outside of this, but have kind of welcomed themselves into this issue that is invasive species from a design perspective and planning perspective. So, you know, a quick thing I'd like to plug, you know, some municipalities developing their own kind of, you know, avoidance list, I guess, for species to avoid in approving new subdivisions when they're working with development entities. A great idea. So, you know, something like, you know, we don't necessarily need to wait for that provincial level of regulation or federal level of regulation, but there's nothing necessarily restricting a conservation authority or a municipality from you know, considering or pursuing you know, avoiding the use of a Bradford pear. You know, that's a great first line of defense in the new development scenario here. But David, I mean, you've worked with the library. Any thoughts, I guess, on engaging with them in a very specific way on that?
Well, I was going to say, dealing with the library, not so much when it came to specific planting ideas, but dealing with the city of Sault Ste. Marie, their horticultural team will say, we're very conscious about trying to use more native plants in their own gardens, as well as since they've had to deal with the emerald ash borer infestation throughout Sault Ste. Marie, they've had to take down several hundred ash trees along Queen Street. So they are very much aware of wanting to plant more native species, you know, moving forward, and what species are going to be hardy in those areas. So I think, like you said, even with new subdivisions, I've heard discussions on using native trees in order, people choosing between oaks or red maples and things like that in order to plant in their front yards rather than Norway maples or other types of invasive trees.
It's great advice. And Colleen, I'll give the last word to you, and then I'll land the plane here.
So Toronto is supposed to have had a no-buy list too, or list of species that they will not plant, not purchase and plant. And a few years ago, I remember hearing about that, and then on the bus on the way home from work, seeing a bunch of Crimson King Norway maples going in. And so this could be different now, because this is a while ago, and I don't mean to upset anyone who might be from the city of Toronto. I'm just using it as an example because that's where I live. So I called Urban Forestry and I said, hey, I thought that you guys didn't order Norway maples. And that person looked into the contract, and the company did a substitution without talking to the city. So it's always an issue of like, there's the actual like best practice, but if you're not on the ground like checking things, sometimes things are still happening that shouldn't. And I guess if you're a grower in Southern Ontario, you might have gotten word that like, oh, people are not wanting Norway maples anymore. Our big orders from the cities might be, you know, we might not be getting those from the future. So maybe there was also a desire to move those along. I don't know for sure. And I don't know if that's still happening. Maybe they are doing more checks on their species, their plants that are going in. What's great is the city, you can sign up for free trees in your front yard, the first little section of your front yard. And those are all, I think they're all non-invasive. They're not invasive, but there definitely are some non-natives, quite a few still non-natives. I see ginkgo going a lot, and I always think that's kind of a missed opportunity because it doesn't host any of our insects. But I think that a number of municipalities that have suffered through emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, now dealing with Norway maples, they're just more and more aware of the issue. But the problem in the big municipalities is like one department is doing something different than another department. So there's still those silo issues that sometimes prevent the whole city, like the city moving as a whole in the right direction. So I think, yeah, still work to be done, but some good progress to also commend.
It's a great opportunity for collaboration between departments too, right? In some of our larger municipalities. So that's it's get so many call to actions in there. So Colleen, thank you, and David, thank you very much. The information you passed on is really helpful, and so glad everybody's still hanging in the line there. So thanks for everybody for hanging tight. I know we were over time here, but appreciate the conversation, and I'm going to take this as a sign of interest for sure if you're still with us. So a quick plug again, as we've got a few good webinars coming up, both within the ISC series and also with some of our key partners at the Biodiversity Council. So just wanted to make note of those. We're going to distribute the recording for this as soon as we can, as soon as we get the editing in check. So watch out for that. If you've registered for this, you'll also see the invite coming around very shortly. And with that in mind, wanted to thank everybody again for tuning in and hanging tight as we've gone over time a bit. Appreciate all the questions coming in and the interest in the topic. There's a lot more to unpack. I hope this is kind of the start of maybe a couple webinars on the general idea and theme here, but so many calls to actions highlighted by David and Colleen both today that we've got lots ahead of us. So thank you very much for tuning in, and wish you all the best and keep safe out there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.